There are places in this world that seem made for patience, and the river-bottom country of southern Idaho in the late summer of 1895 was one of them. The hills rolled down toward the water in long, unhurried curves, and the light in the mornings came soft and golden through the cottonwoods that lined the creek, and if you stood at the edge of an orchard just after sunrise, with the dew still heavy on the grass and the smell of ripening apples thick in the air, you could almost believe that the world was a generous and orderly place. He had believed it, more or less, for the 4 years they had worked that land, 40 acres of river-bottom claim, deeded through patience and back-breaking clearing work, and one very difficult winter that had tested them both in ways neither spoke of afterward, except in the oblique language of people who have come through something together. The apple trees were his particular pride, 24 of them planted in the first spring, another dozen the year after, with plum trees along the south fence, and crab apples near the creek where the soil ran darker and richer. He had built the cabin himself, timber by timber, fitting each joint with the care of a man who had spent years as a carpenter before the land took hold of him. It was a small cabin, but it was solid, with a covered porch facing west, and a root cellar beneath a trap door inside that stayed cool even in August. She had made it a working place. That was the only honest way to say it. The kitchen garden beside the cabin was her domain, beds of berries and root vegetables, rows of herbs she dried in tight bunches from the porch rafters, and her knowledge of preservation and food storage had carried them through every lean season they had faced. She was the kind of woman who watched how things worked before she touched them, who kept notes in a small cloth-bound book she had carried since before they were married, and who had a gift for noticing what other people walked past without seeing. In late August of that year, the trees were heavy with fruit. The harvest, if the weather held, would be the best they had seen. They had $40 of debt outstanding on the land claim, owed to a territorial bank in Delford Crossing, and no cash savings to speak of. The harvest was not simply important, it was everything. The draft horses, Wick and Rudd, moved quietly between the rows when he led them in the mornings, and the mule, Pell, stood patient at the fence with the unhurried dignity that mules sometimes possess. The 4 hens ranged near the cabin door. The whole small enterprise had the feeling of something carefully tended, something coming ripe. Then the wagons came from the Delford packing works, and everything changed. They came in the first week of September, 2 heavy freight wagons running side by side along the wagon road that skirted the eastern edge of the orchard. He was up on a ladder in the crabapple row when he heard them, and he climbed down and stood watching, with his hand shading his eyes. The wagons were loaded high and covered with oilcloth tied down at the corners, but the oilcloth had shifted on the second wagon, and he could see the dull glint of metal underneath. Not tools, not hardware in crates, but loose material, piled without order, the way a man loads something he wants to be rid of. The wagons did not stop at the road. They turned in along the unmarked boundary where the orchard met the open ground to the east, the ground that had never been fenced because he had not yet had the lumber or the time, and the drivers pulled their teams around and backed the wagons and pulled the tailgate pins. The oilcloth came off. The loads came down. It was not a small amount of material. It was a great deal of it. Punched tin sheets, bent and folded into themselves, crushed tin cans flattened to half their height, narrow strips of bright metal curling at the edges, and rejected lids scattered through the whole mass like fallen leaves through gravel. The pile spread itself across the ground along a stretch of 30 feet or more, and the noise of it falling was sharp and sustained, the sound of something breaking rather than being placed. He came across the orchard at a walk, not a run, because he was not a man who ran toward trouble. He asked the drivers what they thought they were doing. One of them, the younger one, who had the manner of a man following orders he had not questioned, said they were clearing the floor of the Delford Packing Works by direction of the foreman, Silas Greer, and that the material was waste, no value assigned, and this ground was as good a place as any for it. He told them this was his land. The driver said he didn't see a fence. The second driver had already climbed back to his seat and was turning the team around. He watched them go down the road in the direction of town. Then he stood for a time, looking at what had been left. The afternoon sun caught the surface of the tin sheets and threw reflected light back in long slashes, bright and unwavering in a way that made the eyes ache. He could smell the metal in the heat, a faint, flat smell, like old water in a tin cup. He walked the length of the pile slowly, looking at the ground beneath it, and what he saw there troubled him as much as the pile itself. The edges of those sheets were not smooth. They were sheared edges, factory cut, and they lay in the grass at the height of an animal's hoof. He went back to the cabin at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not a walk either, the kind of purposeful stride a man uses when he knows that time is already against him. She was in the kitchen garden when he came around the corner of the lean-to, and she read his face before he said a word. She set down the basket she was carrying and came to meet him at the garden's edge. He told her what he had seen. He told her about the drivers and what they had said, and about the edges of the tin lying low in the grass where the horses would be taken to water in the morning. She listened without interrupting, which was her way when the thing being described required her full attention. When he finished, she asked only one question. She asked how far the pile had spread along the boundary. He said perhaps 40 feet, maybe more, and she was already untying her apron as he said it. They brought Wick and Rudd in from the east pasture that evening and stabled them in the lean-to, which was not built for horses but would serve for a night. The mule, Pell, they tied close to the water barrel on the west side of the cabin, away from any path that led toward the orchard's edge. The hens were already roosted and needed no moving. It was not a complete solution. It was a night's worth of time bought against a problem that would still be waiting in the morning. After supper, he sat at the small table near the window with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown wrapping paper and began thinking about fencing. What they had in the way of lumber was limited. The lean-to workshop held perhaps a dozen boards of varying length, some split pine rails stacked behind the barn, and a coil of wire that was not quite sufficient for the span he was imagining. He wrote down the numbers and then looked at them for a while without speaking. She came and stood behind him and looked at the numbers too. She said that if they used the split rails in a single-strand barrier, low and close-spaced, it would not stop a determined animal, but it would slow one enough to prevent a hoof coming down hard on a sheared edge in the dark. He said that was true. She said it would have to do until they decided what to do about the pile itself. What to do about the pile itself? That was the larger question, and neither of them had an answer for it yet. Only the shape of it sitting in their thoughts, the way the reflected light had sat in the afternoon air, bright and difficult to look at directly, and impossible to ignore. He folded the paper and set it beside the lamp for morning. Outside, Wick shifted in the lean-to, and the building creaked, and the night settled in around the cabin. Morning came gray and close, the kind of morning that smells of wet bark and approaching rain before a single cloud has shown itself over the ridge. He was up before full light, the paper already unfolded on the table beside his cold coffee, the numbers looking back at him the same way they had the night before, honest and insufficient. She was at the stove, turning the damper to draw the fire up, and without discussion they both understood that the fence was the first work of the day, and the question of the pile itself was still the second. Some problems, on a working farm, must be addressed in order of their urgency, and an injured animal is more urgent than an injured pride. He brought the split rails out from behind the barn in 2 loads on the stone boat, Pell leaning into the traces with the steady indifference that made him useful for hauling and disagreeable for everything else. She walked the eastern boundary while the light came up, marking the extent of the tin with a row of small stick flags made from stripped willow and torn cloth, the way she had once marked the rows of a new kitchen bed before the first seed went in. The flags stretched farther than either of them had fully reckoned when they had only been standing at the edge looking inward. 40 feet, perhaps 50. The pile ran in a long, shallow drift beneath the outermost apple trees, and in several places it had crept between the root crowns where the soil was soft. He set the first rail post with a mallet, working quietly, and the sound carried flat across the damp air. She counted what they had against what the line required, and told him without ceremony that they were going to be short by a third. He drove the post the rest of the way in and did not answer immediately. Then he said there was the old corral lumber near the far fence, boards he had pulled when he rebuilt the corner post last spring and stacked meaning to burn. She said she had forgotten about those. He said he had almost forgotten about them himself. They worked through the morning without stopping, fitting the rails close to the ground, the lowest strand no higher than a hand's breadth, so that a hoof coming forward in poor light would meet wood before it met tin. It was not a fine fence. It was the kind of fence that communicates only necessity. But by the time the sky had gone from gray to the particular pale yellow that meant midday without sun, the line was closed, and Wick and Rudd were moved to the near pasture, where the grass was thinner, but the ground was clean. She stood at the corner post and looked back along the line, and then past it at the tin. In that flat yellow light, the metal lay dull and harmless-looking. She knew better than to trust that. Pell was the last of the 3 to be moved, and the most difficult about it. The mule had a preference for the east pasture that had nothing to do with the quality of the grass and everything to do with stubbornness of disposition, and he planted himself at the gate and regarded the fence line with what could only be described as professional suspicion. She took hold of his halter and spoke to him in the low, reasonable voice she reserved for animals and for her husband when he was about to make a mistake. Pell considered her argument for a long moment, then walked through the gate with the air of a creature conceding a point he found beneath him. She latched it behind him and stood a moment listening to the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a problem has been addressed but not yet solved. The fence kept the animals safe. It did not move the tin, did not stop its slow creep when the wind shifted and sent a sheet sliding a foot or two along the ground. It did not stop the light. She had noticed in the past 2 days that the reflected glare from the metal collected itself in the afternoon and threw a band of brightness across the south-facing windows of the cabin, the ones she depended on for the good light that made close work possible in the hours before supper. It was not a burning light, not the kind that damages. It was simply relentless. It made the inside of the cabin feel like the inside of a question she had not yet thought to ask. He came around from the workshop side of the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood beside her at the pasture gate. He looked at the fence and said it would hold. She said she knew it would hold. He looked at her and understood that holding was not the matter under consideration. She told him about the light. She described how it moved through the afternoon, the way it gathered against the window glass in a way that ordinary sunlight did not, something about the angle of the metal, the particular curve of some of the larger sheets. He listened the way he listened, when the problem was one he had not yet formed a shape for, without interrupting, without offering a solution before he had heard the whole of it. When she finished, he walked to the fence line and looked along the field of tin, not at it exactly, but past it, the way a carpenter looks at lumber he is trying to understand before he decides what it might become. The afternoon light was doing the thing she had described. She watched him watch it. A broad, slightly bowed sheet near the eastern post had caught the low sun at such an angle that the reflected warmth fell in a concentrated band across a patch of bare ground nearby, vivid and steady, almost like something alive. He said nothing yet, but he did not look away. He stood at that fence line for a long while. She did not rush him. She had learned, in the years they had shared this land, that his silences were not absences. They were the visible surface of something working beneath, the way a creek goes quiet before it bends. She waited, and the afternoon light continued its slow arc, and the bowed tin sheet held its concentration of warmth against the bare ground like a palm held open. He asked her to bring him one of the apple slices she had set out that morning. She went to the cloth she had laid across the porch rail, lifted a piece, and carried it back. He took it and held it a moment, feeling its weight, then walked along the fence until he reached the bowed sheet. He crouched down and placed the slice directly in the band of reflected light on the ground, perhaps 2 feet from the metal itself. Then he stood and looked at the sky, calculating something. He asked her what time she had first set the cloth out. She told him. He nodded slowly. They waited together. The shadow of the fence post moved perhaps the width of a hand before he crouched again and touched the apple slice with 2 fingers. He looked up at her. She crouched beside him and touched it herself. It was noticeably warmer than the pieces on the cloth. Not scorched, not changed in color, but the surface had begun to give in a way that meant the moisture inside was moving. She pressed gently and felt it yield just slightly more than it should have for the time it had been out. He picked it up and held it to the light. He turned it over. He set it back. She said quietly that she had been thinking about a box. He looked at her. She said she meant a cabinet of some kind, something that could hold the warmth in, channel it, keep the rain and the insects away from whatever was drying inside. If the tin could concentrate the heat the way she had seen it do, she wondered whether it might be made to do that work in an enclosed space, somewhere the air could move but the weather could not reach. She was not yet certain of the shape of it. She was only certain that the principle was real and that they had seen it with their own eyes. He was quiet again, but differently this time. His eyes had gone to the lean-to workshop, then to the pile of pine boards stacked along its outer wall, then back to the tin. She recognized the particular quality of that silence, too. It was not the silence of a man who did not know what to do. It was the silence of a man counting in his head, measuring lengths against a shape that had not yet been built, but was already, somehow, almost finished. He said he would need to think about the air. He said he would need to think about the air, and she understood that this was not a delay, but a beginning. She left him to it. There were still apples to be sliced and laid out on whatever flat surface was not yet wet. Still the afternoon light to be used before the next gray shelf of cloud came rolling in from the northwest. She worked with the methodical patience that had always been her particular gift, not hurrying, not wasting, slicing each apple with the same even pressure, laying each piece with the same careful spacing, her mind running quietly alongside her hands on a separate track altogether. She was thinking about enclosure, about what a box needed to do that open air could not. It needed to hold warmth without smothering. It needed to let moisture out. That much was plain, because drying was the business of removing moisture, but it needed to stop cold air and rain from coming in. It needed to let insects neither enter nor rest on whatever was inside, and it needed to make use of the tin, which meant the tin had to face the sun, or face the light the sun produced, and throw that light and warmth inward rather than outward. She thought about bread rising in the covered Dutch oven. She thought about the way the root cellar stayed cool in summer and almost warm in deep winter, simply because it was closed around on all sides. Enclosure did things. Enclosure was not nothing. Behind her, from the lean-to, she could hear the particular sounds of a man not yet building but getting ready to build, the drag of a board being pulled from the stack, the pause, the setting down, the measuring string being drawn taut. He always measured twice before he made a single mark, and 3 times before he cut. It had sometimes frustrated her in early years, that patience of his. Now she found it steadying, the way a well-laid foundation is steadying, simply by existing underfoot. She finished her row of apple slices and stood up straight, pressing one hand briefly to the small of her back. The sky to the northwest had darkened another shade. There was perhaps an hour of good drying light left, maybe less. She looked at the tin sheets stacked along the eastern fence line, and even from this distance she could see the pale shimmer of reflected light moving across the nearest apple rows. The trees themselves seemed almost to lean toward it. She picked up her knife and the next apple and kept working. Inside the lean-to, she heard him say something to himself in a low voice, not to her, not to anyone, just the small murmur of a man working something out. Then the sound of the measuring string again. Then silence. The good kind. Then the first careful scratch of a pencil line drawn across pine. The shape of the thing was beginning. He worked through the last of the afternoon light and into the early dusk, when the lean-to grew too dim for fine marking, and he finally set the pencil down. She heard the change in his movements, the deliberate slowing, the way a careful man does not simply stop, but comes to rest by degrees. She had already brought in the drying cloths and covered the apple trays against the evening damp, and now she stood at the porch railing with a cup of water, watching the northwestern sky settle into the color of a bruise healing. He came out of the lean-to with sawdust along one forearm and a look on his face she recognized. Not satisfaction, not yet, something earlier than that. The look of a man who has found the shape of a problem and confirmed it, will yield to him, eventually, if he is patient enough and does not rush the yielding. She handed him the cup without a word. He drank, looked out at the orchard, looked at the tin along the fence. "The panels want to angle," he said, "not flat against the back wall. Angled, so the light bounces across and up, not straight into whatever's sitting in front of it." She nodded slowly. She had been thinking something close to that herself, but had not found the words for it. "Like a hand cupped around a flame," she said, "not covering it, directing it." He considered that. "More or less," he said. The hens had already gone in. Pell was still near the fence, nosing at a clump of dried grass at the edge of the cleared ground, well back from the remaining tin. She watched the mule a moment, satisfied that he was safe, and then looked back at the lean-to where the pine boards leaned in rough-cut rows against the wall, waiting. "How many trays do you think you can get from what we have?" she asked. He set down the cup and looked at his hands, the way he sometimes did when he was counting in his head. 3 good ones. Maybe a 4th if the lower boards run true. He paused. Enough to start. Enough to start. That was how they had always done things. Not enough to finish, not yet. But enough to begin, and see what the beginning taught them. It was perhaps the most honest thing a person could say on the frontier, she had come to believe. Anyone who claimed to know the end before the work was done was either lying or mistaken. She gathered the empty cup and went inside to start the supper fire, and he followed a few minutes later, stopping at the wash basin to scrub the sawdust from his arms. The cabin filled slowly with the smell of wood smoke and dried herbs from the ceiling bundles, and outside the last gray light faded from the orchard, leaving everything, the trees, the tin, the quiet waiting pine boards, held in the same patient dark. The morning came in cold and still, with a ground mist lying low between the tree rows that did not lift until nearly 9 o'clock. He was in the lean-to workshop before full light, a candle set in a tin holder on the corner post, working by feel as much as by sight. She heard the first careful strokes of the hand plane before she had the fire built, a steady, patient sound that seemed to belong to the mist and the early hour equally. She had slept poorly, not from worry exactly, but from the particular restlessness that comes when the mind has hold of a problem it is not yet finished with. The tray spacing had occupied her through the dark hours. In the first cabinet, she had set the trays at equal intervals, the way one would arrange shelves in a pantry, which was a reasonable thing to do, but, as it turned out, not the right thing. Air did not move through a cabinet the way dishes sat on shelves. It rose, and it pooled, and it stalled wherever something blocked its path. The lowest tray had dried adequately, the middle tray had dried well, the uppermost tray had dried fastest of all, but had also scorched the fruit nearest the tin panel, because it was both the hottest position and the most exposed to the reflected heat. She had lain awake working out that the trays should not be evenly spaced, but graduated, wider apart near the lower vents where the incoming air was still cool and moist, closer together in the upper third where the heat was already doing its work and needed only to be held a moment longer. She wanted to tell him before he cut the dado grooves in the sideboards, because once those grooves were cut, the spacing was fixed for good. She pulled her shawl over her shoulders and went out through the covered porch, the boards cold and damp under her feet. The mist was silvery at the orchard edge, and the tin sheets lay dark and quiet beyond the fence of scrap lumber he had put up the week before. Even heaped and still, they held a kind of waiting quality, as though they understood they were going to be made useful. He looked up when she came through the lean-to door. The candle threw soft shadows across the pine board, laid flat across the sawhorses, the dado saw still in his hand, not yet begun. She told him about the spacing. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she valued most in him. Not agreement necessarily, but the willingness to hear the whole thought before forming a response. When she finished, he set down the saw and looked at the board for a moment. "Show me," he said. She found a scrap of pine and a carpenter's pencil and marked the intervals she had worked out in the dark. He studied the marks, turned the scrap over in his hands, and nodded slowly. "That'll change the chimney opening too," he said, "but I think you're right." They worked through the rest of that early morning with the candle between them and the mist pressing quietly against the lean-to's single window. She held the scrap of pine while he transferred her penciled intervals onto the actual board, his carpenter's rule moving in short, sure strokes. There was a companionable silence to it, the kind that accumulates between two people who have spent enough years working side by side that words become optional for the practical portions of a task. The spacing she had calculated was not dramatic, a matter of 2 inches more between each tray than the first cabinet had allowed. But those 2 inches, she had reasoned in the dark, were the difference between air that stalled and air that moved. Heat wants to climb. Give it a clear path, and it obliges. Crowd it, and it lingers against the nearest surface, which in the first dryer had been the fruit itself. The scorched rings on those early apple slices had taught her that. He saw it the same way once he studied her marks. He said the chimney slot would need to be wider to pull the column of rising air more steadily, and she agreed, because a wider draw at the top would encourage the cooler air to enter more willingly at the lower vents, rather than simply pooling at the floor of the cabinet. They talked it through in the manner of people solving a problem together rather than dividing it, each thought prompting the next, neither keeping score of whose idea was whose. By the time the mist began to thin and the first gray light came through the orchard, They had a revised drawing scratched onto a full pine board, dimensions noted in his cramped, even hand along the margins. The cabinet would be the same height, roughly 5 feet, but the interior would be arranged differently. The tin panels would be angled more steeply so that the reflected heat was directed upward through the tray gaps rather than cast sideways toward the fruit. The trays themselves would be spaced at her intervals, each one seated in shallow dado slots so they could be lifted out cleanly. The vent slats at the bottom would be hinged on wooden pegs so they could be opened wider or nearly closed, depending on the strength of the afternoon sun. And the cheesecloth, that detail they agreed on without much discussion at all, because both of them had watched enough spoiled summer food to understand what an open gap meant in the season of flies and yellow jackets. Every opening would be covered. The dryer would be, in a sense, a sealed room that breathed on command. He began cutting the new boards as the sun cleared the eastern hills and the tin waste beyond the fence caught the first light and threw it back in scattered ribbons. She went inside to start the fire and put water on, thinking about the panels, how they would need to be flattened carefully, their edges turned safe before they were ever touched with bare hands. The flattening of the tin was its own kind of labor, and it asked for patience before it asked for strength. He had learned early in his carpentry years that metal behaved nothing like wood, that it held grudges in a way timber did not, that a sheet bent once would remember the bend and resist being told otherwise. So he did not fight it. He laid each salvaged panel across the flat face of a broad pine stump he used as a work table, and he coaxed it down with a wooden mallet rather than the steel hammer, working from the center outward in slow overlapping strokes, the way a man might flatten bread dough if bread dough could cut him through his gloves. The tin gave, gradually. It never gave all at once. She brought him the ones she had already sorted from the pile, the sheets that were large enough to be useful, that had not been punched too many times or crumpled past a certain point. She had developed an eye for it faster than he had, which did not surprise him. She could look at a piece of tin the way she looked at fruit on the branch, reading some quality in it that was visible only to a person who was paying the right kind of attention. These she stacked near his elbow. The others she set aside in a second pile that would be used for bracing, for the internal frame, for the small brackets that would hold the dado-slotted tray rails in place along the cabinet walls. The turning of the edges was her task, because her hands were steadier at close work. She used the small flat file from his carpentry roll and the wooden forming block he made her that morning, a length of scrap pine with a shallow groove cut along one face, just deep enough to fold the tin edge over cleanly when she pressed it down with the handle of a table knife. The result was a hem no wider than a thumbnail, smooth and no longer sharp. It took time. It took more time than either of them had estimated when they talked it through over the morning fire. But they did not rush it, because they both understood that a panel installed with an unturned edge would, eventually, mean an injury, and an injury in that season with that much work still ahead of them was a cost they could not afford. By mid-morning, the first 4 panels were finished and stacked in the lean-to, their edges folded, their faces reasonably flat and bright in the thin autumn light that came through the workshop gap. He held one up and angled it slowly, watching how the reflected light moved across the ceiling boards, sharp and mobile, like something alive. She stood at the lean-to doorway watching him do it, and she thought, yes, that is the thing. That is exactly the thing we are trying to put to work. They set the finished panels aside and turned to the cabinet frame itself, which he had roughed out the day before from salvaged pine, uprights mortised into a base, crosspieces notched to receive the tray rails, the whole thing standing just over 5 feet when he lifted it upright against the lean-to wall. It was not elegant. The joints were close enough, the wood dry enough, and that was what mattered. He had built enough furniture in his earlier years to know when a frame was sound and when it was merely convincing, and this one was sound. She spent the better part of that morning measuring the tray spacing. She had decided, after thinking it through the previous evening while the fire burned low, that the distance between trays needed to be generous enough to allow air to move freely between them, but not so great that the cabinet grew too tall to manage. She settled on 5 trays, each spaced about 7 inches apart, and she marked the tray rail positions on the uprights with a carpenter's pencil, checking twice before he drove any nail. It was that kind of work, patient, deliberate, the kind that asks you to think ahead by 3 steps before you make the move in front of you. He fitted the lower air vents next, 3 horizontal slots cut near the base of each side panel, each slot wide enough to allow a current of air to enter, but narrow enough to be covered with cheesecloth against insects. The cheesecloth she had in the house already, a remnant from preserving season, and she cut it into strips and set them ready. The chimney slot at the top came last for the frame. He cut it with a handsaw, a narrow rectangle across the upper back panel, just below the roofline of the cabinet. When he blew a slow breath through the base vents and held his palm above the chimney slot, he could feel the faintest draw, air moving upward the way warm air naturally wished to move. She watched him do it and nodded, satisfied. Then came the panels. He had thought carefully about the angle. Too steep, and the reflected heat would climb past the trays entirely and escape through the chimney slot without doing any useful work. Too shallow, and the panels would direct heat straight into the wood of the trays rather than into the air above them. He wanted something in between, a tilt that would throw the gathered light forward and upward in a gentle curve, warming the column of air rising through the cabinet rather than scorching any single surface. She held the first panel while he tried different angles, asking her to hold it a degree or 2 higher, a degree lower, watching where the reflected light fell on the interior crosspieces. They spent most of an hour on the angle of a single panel before he finally called it right. She agreed without hesitation, because she had been watching too, and she had reached the same conclusion 2 minutes before he said it aloud. The remaining panels went in more quickly after that, because they had learned the angle by feel now, not just by measurement. He had made a simple wooden jig, 2 notched blocks that held the panel at the correct tilt, while he drove the small brads through the bracing strips, so that each new sheet could be set to match the first without any additional trial. She watched him use the jig and recognized it for what it was, a man who did not want to solve the same problem twice. It was one of the things she had always valued in him. By the time the afternoon light was beginning to soften toward the western ridgeline, all 4 interior panels were in place. The inside of the cabinet looked unlike anything either of them had built before. The tin caught the diffused light coming through the vent openings and threw it in soft, overlapping bands across the underside of the tray frames. Not harsh, not concentrated to a point, but spread and gentle and persistent. She put her hand inside at tray height and held it still. The warmth against her palm was noticeable, but not uncomfortable. It was the warmth of a room that had been closed all afternoon, not the warmth of a stove. That distinction mattered enormously. She had brought apple slices prepared that morning, cut to roughly the same thickness she had used in the first cabinet, so that the comparison would be fair. She laid them out across 2 of the trays, spacing them the way she had learned to space them from weeks of outdoor drying, close enough to make use of the surface, but not so close that the edges touched and the moisture could not escape freely. The cloth over the vent openings filtered the light coming in to something faintly golden. The chimney slot at the top stood open, facing away from the prevailing wind. He fastened the front panel closed with a simple wooden peg latch, and they both stepped back. There was a long moment of quiet, Not uncertainty, exactly. They had been too careful for that. But the particular stillness that comes just before you discover whether a thing you have reasoned out will behave the way you believed it would, when the reasoning was only words and sketches on a piece of paper. A late bee moved through the grass near the root cellar door. Somewhere up in the orchard, one of the horses shifted its weight and the halter ring clinked softly against a post. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the cabinet standing there in the afternoon sun, its pine boards still pale and new, the tin glinting faintly along the seam where the front panel met the side, the cheesecloth over the lower vents trembling just barely in the slow movement of rising air. He said nothing. Neither did she. They would open it in the morning and find out what the night had decided. That night she did not sleep well. It was not worry, precisely, or not only worry. It was more the way the mind refuses to let go of a thing it has been holding tightly for so long. She lay on her side, listening to the creak move in the darkness, and found herself going through the whole interior of the cabinet as if she were small enough to stand inside it. The angled tin panels throwing their light upward and away from the trays, the lower vents drawing air in, the chimney slot pulling it out from the top, the cheesecloth keeping the moths and the small crawling things from finding their way to the fruit. She had set the trays with careful hands. The apple slices were cut thin and even. She had done what she could do. He was asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady, one arm crooked beneath his head. He always slept this way after a day of hard building, not the sleep of a man without care, but the sleep of a man who has spent every care he had and closed the account for the night. She envied it some. She had never learned that particular art. She rose once, near midnight, and went to the covered porch. The sky had cleared after sundown, and the stars were heavy and closed the way they get in late August, when the air has gone dry at last. The cabinet stood in the yard, a dark shape against the pale grass, and she could see the faint pale square of cheesecloth over the lower vents. She stood there for a little while, her shawl around her shoulders, listening. There was nothing to hear, of course. Warm air does not make a sound when it moves through wood and tin in the dark. That was its nature. Patient, invisible, working whether you watched it or not. She went back inside and slept until first light. He was already up when she woke, and she knew by the sound of his boots on the porch floor that he had not opened the cabinet yet. He was waiting for her. She dressed quickly and came out to find him standing a few feet from the cabinet with a mug of coffee, looking at it the way a man looks at a river he is about to ford. Not afraid, but measuring. She took the mug from him, drank once, and handed it back. He stepped forward and lifted the wooden peg from its slot. The front panel swung open on its leather hinges, and the smell came out first. Warm and sweet and dry, a smell like the inside of a pantry in October, concentrated and clean. They both leaned in. The apple slices on the upper tray had gone pale gold at the edges, their surfaces papery and faintly translucent. She reached in and pressed one gently between her thumb and forefinger. It gave the way dried fruit gives. Firm, not brittle, the moisture pulled out evenly. She looked at him. He said nothing. She said nothing. There was a kind of ceremony to it, the way they both stood there in the early light, with the cabinet open between them, and she understood that whatever words came next would have to be the right ones, or none at all. She set the apple slice on her palm and held it up toward the sky, where the sun had only just begun to clear the tree line above the eastern ridge. The slice caught the light. Pale gold, she thought again, like something that had been asked a question and had answered it correctly. She said, "It worked." He exhaled slowly, and she could hear in that breath everything he had not said aloud across the last several days, the doubt he had carried quietly, so she would not have to share it. The worry about the storm coming back, the weight of the $40, and the 6 weeks of food, and all the rest of it. He reached in and lifted a slice from the lower tray, pressed it the same way she had, and nodded once. They pulled every tray out and set them on the porch railing in the morning light and counted what they had. 2 full trays of apple, firm and evenly dried. 1 tray of crabapple rings, slightly darker, which she had expected given their tartness and the thinness of the cut. Half a tray of herb bundles, the leaves crumbled dry between her fingers when she touched them, which was exactly as it should be. The lowest tray, closest to the vent openings, had dried more slowly. The slices there were still soft at their centers, not ruined but not finished. She noted that without distress, it was information. She turned it over in her mind the way she turns soil with a spade, looking for what it told her about depth and air. He had already gone to the lean-to and come back with a short length of pine board and his marking pencil. She watched him sketch without being asked, a small diagram of the tray positions, a note about the lower vent spacing, an arrow indicating where the heat moved through the interior. His handwriting was careful and square, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a man who measures twice. She leaned over his shoulder and pointed to the lower tray, and he drew a second arrow and wrote the word slower and circled it. They loaded the finished dried fruit into clean cloth sacks and carried them down through the trapdoor into the root cellar, where the cool, dark air received them without complaint. She set each sack on the shelf with her own hands, pressed them flat, smoothed the cloth over the top. It felt like putting something to rest that had earned its rest. When she came back up the ladder, he was already at the workbench in the lean-to, selecting boards for the second cabinet. The second cabinet went up faster than the first, because he knew the wood now the way a man knows a road he has walked before, not without thought, but without hesitation. He selected boards from the pile he had stacked against the lean-to wall, running his thumb along each edge before he chose it, setting aside the ones that cupped or split without ceremony. She brought him a cup of water and stayed to watch, and he did not ask her to leave, because her watching was never idle. She was thinking while she watched. That was something he had understood about her a long time ago. The changes they had agreed on were small but deliberate. He angled the tin panels inward along the lower walls, rather than setting them flush, so the reflected heat would rise into the body of the cabinet, rather than press directly against the nearest tray. He cut the vent slats a fraction narrower and spaced the lower openings farther apart, giving the air a longer path to travel before it climbed. She had suggested covering every opening with cheesecloth before he thought to mention it, and so he stretched the cloth tightly over each vent frame and tacked it at the corners while she held the fabric smooth. By late afternoon, the second cabinet stood beside the first, in the thin south-facing light between the orchard and the cabin wall. He had built it 2 inches taller, which she had asked for without being entirely certain why, only that the taller interior seemed to her likely to breathe more evenly, the way a high-ceilinged room holds heat differently than a low one. He trusted that kind of reasoning from her. It was the reasoning of someone who had spent years watching bread rise and cider ferment and fruit shrink on a cloth in the afternoon sun. Reasoning that lived in the hands as much as the head. They loaded both cabinets with fresh sliced apples before the light began to angle low and golden through the orchard trees. She placed the trays with care, leaving space at each edge, not packing the slices too closely. The smell that rose from the open cabinet doors before she latched them was sweet and faintly warm, the smell of something being changed into something better and more lasting. He stood back and looked at the 2 cabinets standing side by side in the yard. They were plain wooden boxes, rough-cut and honest, nothing that would draw a second glance from a stranger passing on the road. but they held inside them something that had not existed 3 weeks ago, and that fact settled over him quietly, the way the evening settled over the orchard, without announcement. He picked up his pencil and made a note about the tray spacing. That night he stayed at the workbench in the lean-to long after she had gone inside, the lantern burning low, his pencil moving across a scrap of pine board he was using as a notepad because proper paper cost money they did not have. He was not sketching anything grand. He was writing down the small things, the width of the vent slats, the angle he had cut the tin panels, the distance from the lowest tray to the floor, numbers that lived in his hands when he was building, but that had a way of drifting loose if he did not pin them down in words. She came to the lean-to door with a cup of water for him sometime past 9 o'clock, the night air carrying the dry coolness that had been arriving earlier each evening as September deepened. She looked at what he was writing, without reading it aloud, which was her way. She understood that the writing was part of the thinking, not the conclusion of it. He told her he was trying to work out whether the vent opening at the top needed to be adjustable or whether a fixed width would serve well enough across different weather. She sat on the edge of the workbench and considered it. She said that in her experience, the problem was never the hot days. On a hot day, almost any arrangement moved air. The problem was a cool day with light cloud, when the heat came in slowly and the air inside the cabinet barely stirred. On a day like that, she said, you wanted the top vent as narrow as possible to hold what warmth you had. He wrote that down. She watched him write it. Outside, the orchard stood quiet in the dark, and somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the trees, the tin waste lay in its long, pale drifts, ghostly in the starlight, more of it than they could yet account for. He had walked that ground again in the late afternoon, before supper, trying to estimate what they had. The better sheets, the ones that had arrived flat or could be flattened, numbered in the hundreds. There was enough material in that waste to build not 2 cabinets, or 10, but many more than that, if they could work through the weeks remaining before hard frost. He did not say this aloud yet. He only wrote his vent measurement and set down the pencil. She took the cup back from him and rinsed it at the outside bucket and came back to say good night. He kissed her on the temple the way he always did, that small habitual tenderness that meant more in the accumulation of years than any single gesture could. Then he picked the pencil up again. The next morning he was up before the sky had any color in it at all. She heard him at the workbench in the lean-to, that familiar rhythm of measuring and marking, the small sounds of a man who thinks best with his hands occupied. She lay still a moment longer than usual, listening to it, and felt something she would later have difficulty naming, something between gratitude and relief, the feeling of knowing that the person beside you in a hard season is not diminished by difficulty, but clarified by it. She dressed and went out to start the fire. By the time the light came gray and thin over the eastern ridge, they had both eaten and were already at the tin. He had organized the previous day's sorted piles with more precision overnight, apparently because she found them in new configurations when she crossed the frost-stiffened grass, the flattest sheets stacked in one row, the curved and bent ones in another, the narrow strips bundled with cord. He had been out here in the dark, or very near dark, rearranging by feel and memory. She did not remark on it. She simply took up her gloves and began. The morning's work was counting. Not building, not cutting, only counting and measuring with the folding rule and recording in the small ledger she had begun keeping alongside his cabinet notes. Each category of material had its own column now: full flat sheets, partial sheets, usable strips, scrap too narrow for panels but serviceable as interior bracing. She moved down the rows slowly, calling figures aloud, and he marked them without looking up. By mid-morning they had their first real accounting. It was larger than either of them had let themselves believe. He stood at the edge of the sorted rows and looked at the numbers she had written, and then he looked at the remaining drifts of unsorted tin that still lay further along the eastern boundary, and something shifted quietly behind his expression. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of steady reckoning, the way a man looks when a problem he has been holding carefully in both hands finally resolves into something he can work with. She watched him look at those numbers. She waited. He said, at last, that if the weather held through October, and he said it carefully, without assumption, the way a man says a thing he knows is not guaranteed, they could build enough to make a genuine difference, not just for themselves, for the settlement entire. She looked at the ledger in her hands, and then at the orchard beyond him, the fruit still hanging, still waiting, the light coming stronger now across the valley. She told him they had better not waste the day standing still. They did not waste it. The morning moved into afternoon, with the particular quality of motion that belongs to people who have stopped deliberating and started doing. He sorted the longer tin strips by width and set aside the curved sheets with the brightest face, those that had shown, from the beginning, the strongest tendency to gather and redirect light. She pulled the lumber tally from the lean-to shelf and walked the yard, calculating how many frames they had boards enough to start, how many would need to wait on a trip to Alf Nestor's trading post, and whether the cheesecloth remaining in the cabin chest would stretch to cover the remaining orders, or whether she needed to account for that as well. It was, she would have said if asked, not so different from the first weeks of the harvest. You put your attention on the task directly in front of you. You did not think about October all at once. You thought about the next cut, the next measurement, the next tray. He had developed a rhythm in the building by now that was something to watch. He had always been a methodical carpenter, never fast, but almost never wrong, and what had changed was that he knew the design the way he knew the orchard rows, from the inside, without having to think about it. The angled tin panels went in at a consistent slant, tested by eye against the afternoon light before he fixed them. The vent slats were cut and fitted so they could be adjusted without removing them. The trays rode their rails smoothly. Each cabinet, when it was finished, held a proportional weight of intention and patience that made it look like something built to last. She spent part of the afternoon running a new set of test slices, apple and plum, thin cut, laid at intervals across 3 different tray positions, not because she doubted the design, but because the settling weather had shifted the angle of the sun, and she wanted to understand what that meant for drying time. She recorded her observations in the ledger in the same small handwriting she used for everything, adding to a column of notes that had grown considerably since the early experiments. Knowledge did not stop being useful just because you had enough of it to get by. By the time the light began to flatten toward evening, there were 3 more finished cabinets standing in the yard alongside the others. The rows were lengthening in a way that had started to change the look of the property altogether. She stood at the porch step and counted them in the fading light. Then she looked at the eastern boundary where the unsorted tin still lay waiting, and she thought about what he had said that morning, carefully, without assumption, about the weather holding through October. The next morning brought a sky that had not fully decided what it meant to do. There was cloud along the northern ridge, thin and pale, moving slowly enough that it could dissolve by midday or thicken by afternoon. He watched it while he ate, standing at the open doorway with his coffee, and then he went to work without remarking on it. The weather would do what it would do. What they could manage was the pace of what happened in the yard. He had been sorting the remaining tin for 3 days in careful stages, pulling the sharpest and most irregular pieces to one side, setting aside the cleanest flat sheets in a separate stack, running his eye along each piece before he committed it to any pile. It was slow work and he did not hurry it. The pile awaiting use was smaller than it looked from a distance, because so much of what the factory had discarded was bent in ways that required straightening before it would lie flat enough to be useful, and straightening took time. But the pile was still considerable. He had made calculations in his head and then on paper, and he believed the material would carry them through perhaps 8 more cabinets beyond the ones already finished, possibly 9 if he was careful. 9 was a number worth being careful for. She came out to the lean-to workshop mid-morning, with the ledger open in her hands, reading aloud from the column of pending orders as she walked. 3 farmers had sent word the previous day through Orrin Pask, who seemed to have become an informal messenger in addition to his other occupations. 2 of the orders were for single cabinets. 1 was for 2, with a request that the trays be spaced to accommodate longer cuts of dried meat as well as fruit. She read the specifications, and he listened without interrupting, fitting a side panel as she spoke. When she finished, she set the ledger on the workbench and picked up a piece of the angled tin bracing, turning it slowly to examine the bend he had pressed into it. He said it had taken him 4 attempts to get that angle consistent. She said she could tell, because the earlier ones were slightly different from each other and the last 3 were not. He did not say anything to that, but there was something in the set of his jaw that might, in better light, have been taken for satisfaction. She set the piece back down carefully and looked out across the yard at the finished cabinets, standing in their rows, and beyond them at the unsorted pile, and beyond that at the orchard where the remaining fruit still hung waiting. 8 cabinets, perhaps 9. The weather was holding. The weather held 3 more days, which was exactly the number of days they needed. She had begun keeping a kind of private count, not written anywhere but carried in her head the way a woman carries a tally she does not wish to speak aloud for fear of breaking the arithmetic. The number of cabinets completed, the number of orders confirmed, the number of days since the last hard rain, the number of days, she estimated, before the first true snow would come down off the higher country and settle into the valley for good. These were not pleasant numbers to hold, but they were honest ones, and she had always found honesty in numbers a more reliable comfort than false reassurance in words. He built through the mornings without stopping only to eat what she brought to the workshop doorway and then returning before the plate was fully cleared. She had stopped asking him whether he needed rest, and he had stopped telling her he did not. They had arrived, somewhere in the middle of that last week, at an understanding that did not require language. The work was the thing. The work was also, in some way she could not have precisely named but felt clearly, the proof of something between them that had needed proving, not to anyone else but to themselves. On the 3rd day of held weather, Alf Nestor sent his boy around with a note confirming that he had spoken to 3 more farms to the north of Delford Crossing, and that 2 of them wished to purchase before month's end. She added the orders to the ledger in her careful hand and stood for a moment with the pen still between her fingers, looking at the column of figures. Then she called to him in the workshop and read the numbers aloud through the open door. There was a pause in the hammering. Then it resumed. By late afternoon, the 9th cabinet stood finished in the yard, and he had begun the 10th. The braces for the tin panels were cut and waiting. The angled reflectors had become almost habitual to him now, the angle pressed in with a consistency that required no measurement, only memory in the hands. And she had noticed this and not said anything because some things did not improve when spoken. The cheesecloth was cut and tacked. The vent slats were fitted and tested. He ran a thumb along the lower seam to check for gaps and found none. She walked the row of finished cabinets as the afternoon light began to soften, touching each one lightly at the corner as she passed, the way a person touches fence posts on a walk they have made enough times to stop counting. 8 sold, 2 more nearly ready. The orchard still hung with its last fruit. The weather was holding, but not forever. The 10th cabinet was finished before supper. She brought him bread and cold beans on the porch, and they ate without much talking, watching the last light move across the yard, where the row of cabinets stood in their patient line. The orchard was quiet behind them. The apples that remained on the branches caught the evening color and held it, the way fruit does near the end of the season, as though it has learned by then to make the most of available light. They had cleared the debt 3 days before. He had walked to Delford Crossing with the exact sum folded in an envelope and returned with the receipt in his coat pocket, and when he laid it on the table she had smoothed it flat with her palm and said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of ceremony. $40, the number that had sat at the edge of every decision for 2 years, quiet and insistent as a stone in a boot, was simply gone. The root cellar was full. She had checked it that morning, the way she checked most things, methodically, without hurry, lifting the trapdoor and going down with the lantern to count the crocks, the dried rings of apple, the paper-wrapped bundles of herb, the small cloth sacks of crabapple chips, the braided strings of dried plum that hung from the low beam and swayed slightly when she moved. There was enough. There was more than enough. She stood there for a moment in the cool and the dark and let herself know it. The snow came in the night. Not hard, not the kind that closes roads and bends fences, but steady and quiet and entirely sincere, the first real snow of the season, the kind that does not apologize or retreat. By morning it lay white and even across the yard and the garden and the orchard, and the row of finished dryer cabinets stood along the fence with a thin line of white along each roof, like something waiting to be signed. He went out early to check the horses and the mule. She stood at the porch and looked at the yard and at the gate, and at the road that ran past the eastern edge of the property, where the tin had once lain in its rusting, dangerous drifts. The road was empty. Later that morning, while the snow was still falling in its unhurried way, he climbed the short ladder with a hammer and 4 nails and hung the painted sign above the cabin door. She stood below and told him it was straight when it was straight. He came down, and they both looked at it for a moment. Hartwell Solar Dryers, Est 1 1595. The snow